So this idea, what I'm calling the facticity of the urban, the idea that the urban or the city are just kind of self-evident and bounded. And this, I want to argue, this is kind of one of the main arguments of the lecture, which at this level of abstraction, it might not make immediate sense, but I'll explain it. I want to interpret it as a kind of naive objectivism, which is it's an approach to the philosophy of knowledge. And it can be very simply summarized. It's not just in urban studies. There are lots of traditions of social science that embrace naive objectivism. And it's just basically the idea that sensory knowledge is primary, that the senses, sensory experience, what we see, what we hear, that provides us with true and accurate, unmediated knowledge of the world as it is. So just, there are empirical entities in the world, and simply by looking, by using our senses, we can understand the essence of life. And in urban, there are many examples of this in the social sciences and other traditions of science. But in urban studies, naive objectivism basically treats the city in the way that I just described, as a empirically self-evident entity based on selective indicators, usually of spatial concentration. So we'll talk more about concentration presently in the course of this lecture. Like, there are different ways of understanding concentration depending on what's being concentrated. Is it people? Is it infrastructure? Is it economic activity? Is it something else? But the general kind of underlying assumption is that, well, it's a coming together of something in space, human beings, for example. Population would be the most obvious indicator. So urban studies, to the degree that it embraces naive objectivism, it just treats that coming together of people and stuff in space as empirically self-evident. So again, the most common indicators, which I'll unpack in the course of the lecture, that are used in such approaches would be population, size or density. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Land use characteristics, so it could be the idea of like vertical built environments like skyscrapers, or just simply densely packed built environment like buildings and bridges and roads, stuff like that. In technical terms, impervious surfaces. Or it could be land values, like the property, the value of land in, let's say, the Loop might be higher than land in quote unquote rural Illinois. So land value would also be an indicator, but something about the concentration. So what's the problem with this? You might just think, well, of course we need to use sensory experience. I also agree. Like, we need to use our eyes, our ears. We need to pay attention. The question is whether sensory experience is actually not mediated. In other words, it's not that I'm rejecting the idea that we should use our sensory experience. Of course we must. It's a question of how do we understand sensory experience? And the point that critics of naive objectivism would make, myself included, is that experience is mediated through underlying frameworks of interpretation. So demarcating the parameters for any empirical data, it always involves an assumption, that a set of assumptions, a framework, we could say a theory, that's not itself empirical. It's sort of like a framework, like literally, like think of spectacles. It's like I might see the world through my spectacles, but the spectacles themselves are prior to what I see. So a theory or a framework, it's just kind of like we all use different frameworks to think about the world and to do different things in the world. So the sort of literally the optical metaphor is I think a useful one. We always have some kind of lens, some kind of framework. So for example, choosing which indicator we're going to use to map the urban or anything else involves an interpretive framework. Like I might say, no, it's population. And you might say, no, it's land cover. And someone else might say, no, it's connectivity. So we're already in the realm of theory. In other words, if we're debating about population, and we can also, I'll come to this in a moment, but just to give you an advanced taste, I might say the population threshold for what I'm measuring is 25 million. And you might say, that's ridiculous. The relevant population threshold is 1,000. So those are theoretical assumptions that require justification, even though we may agree about, how to measure where people are and where they cluster, although that itself generates complexity. Why does a specific social process, let's say illustrated through population or economic connectivity, express itself in an urban geography? So in other words, it's one thing to say population matters, but we still have to understand and explain why is it the case that population seems to cluster. In other words, we can, like, even if we agree, which is a big if, that population is the relevant indicator for urbanization. Let's just say we agree on that, which I actually think it's part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story. But let's just say we agree that's the leading indicator. And we go out and we measure population, density or distribution around the world. We still have an interpretive problem, which is, why do people cluster together in these units? So that can't simply be decided through documenting and measuring where people are. You need a framework. And then the question, which I'm going to have a lot to say about today, is how do we demarcate the boundaries? Are there boundaries? Is there an inside and an outside of the urban, which the whole field of urban studies has generally tried for the last 150 years to demarcate an inside and an outside? I'm skeptical about that. It doesn't mean that I think everything is the same, but I'm going to raise some questions about whether, because I think of the urban as a process rather than a thing, I'm going to raise some questions about whether that process is neatly bounded. It might just simply be unevenly developed and mutating, and the spatiality of the process can't be captured very well simply through the metaphor of bounding. So instead of just assuming the way that a thing-based epistemology of the urban does, that the urban is a bounded settlement type, differentiated from other settlement types, we actually need to ask whether that's true. What are the trade-offs of thinking about the world that way versus other ways that we might think about it? So these are some problems with a naive objectivist approach, is they tend to put those kinds of interpretive considerations in the background, even though I would argue, even a naive objectivist approach, which privileges sensory data, it always presupposes underlying interpretive assumptions about everything that I just summarized, but they're not explicitly interrogated, they're just taken for granted. So there's no way, it's not a question of, should we use a theoretical framework or should we just trust sensory data? What I'm suggesting here is that any appropriation of sensory data always involves an interpretive framework. And we need to make that clear so that we can critically reflect on whether the interpretive framework is the one we want to use and whether we can defend it. So these questions, all the ones I've just been summarizing, are not decidable simply through data collection. Their resolution requires theory. In other words, a more abstract analysis along the lines of what we've really been doing this whole quarter so far.